The background on this is pretty brief. This was an item that was identified during our land use audit in 2014 with our insurance carrier to address a process to establish regulations for tent encampments in the city. We commenced that process in 2014. You may recall that in August we briefed on a draft ordinance. At that time, we were establishing the Human Services Committee, and there was interest expressed at that time to have the committee review those draft regulations and come back with some recommendations. This is, after a brief pause here, a review of those regulations, and there's been some pretty wholesale changes. So I wanted to take a little time to kind of walk you through those changes. They're pretty significant. The original draft was really geared after what a number of other larger cities have been doing to try to address a process to allow these tent encampments, but anticipating they were large and they would have a lot of management issues and complexities to them, to have a process that addressed all those different elements. When this was reviewed by the Human Services Committee, one of the items that really jumped out was it's not likely that Shelton is going to have a tent encampment of 100 more people like Bellevue or some other larger city has. We're probably at a smaller scale, and our need is going to be at a smaller scale. Can we have something that addresses that and in turn is regulated in a manner that addresses what we anticipate to be the impacts, which would be much less for a smaller facility than a larger facility? So the draft that you have before you sort of incorporated those basic components, and then I'll go into the deal how that was done. Another element that was identified pretty early by the committee was if something like the draft regulations that were being presented was actually introduced and passed, it would require that the temporary encampment move every 90 days to a different facility. And those different facilities would have to have all the physical components and all the management pieces that the other ones would have to have. So that the concept was that this would minimize the impact on a neighborhood if you're moving this every 90 days. But in practicality, that placed a real burden on what is probably a very limited number of churches that would even have the grounds or the ability to accommodate this. It would likely mean that some time during the year, those facilities wouldn't be operational at all. So we wanted to also address how that could be accommodated within Shelton and what our resources would allow. So in the end, what was decided upon was to offer a process where a approval is sort of tiered based on the number of occupants, the type of occupants, and where it was located. In addition, there was a lot of interest to establish regulations that allowed someone to accommodate family members on their property in a similar manner, but at a very smaller scale. So the first tier that's in the new regulations addresses that provision that would allow a property owner to accommodate family members on site in a similar type of fashion, and it describes in about 6 or 8 different regulations how that is focused. You're in the rear yard, you're screened, there's access to bathrooms, and all those basic safety and sanitary conditions are addressed. A second tier would allow a somewhat larger accommodation, but it wouldn't necessarily be family members, to occur with a very limited amount of oversight. And that was, I think, up to 6 individuals or 2 families. And so that was the medium tier that was described in the draft regulations. The third tier, the larger tier, is very similar to the type of encampment that was originally proposed, but it would be, again, a smaller scale. What is being proposed here is an encampment of up to 30 individuals. It includes many of the same provisions that the original regulations required, but changed some of those out, and a fair amount of the staff report addressed those basic changes. Let me go over those if I can in just a moment here. One of the requirements was that a log needed to be kept of all the individuals that were on the grounds at all times, and had to be current. That seemed a little onerous, and the fact that you had to maintain those records for 6 months after you closed your encampment to make those records accessible. That was removed from these new provisions. Another provision was that didn't get addressed really is the
excuse me just a second. So I'm following, tracking, and I'm going through everything with you. Can I ask just a question?
You bet.
So you said now the requirement of the log of the names of the individuals was erroneous or something. Says this is still something that they're going to do. They're going to have a list of people that are in the camp. Is that?
They're going to ask for names and verify you have proper identification. They want to know who you are. But if you decide to leave on Tuesday, they may or may not know that, and their record may not reflect that. They'll eventually figure that out, perhaps, but they don't need to have a close, accurate record all the time.
Oh, not a check-in every night kind
Right.
of situation. Okay, that's the part that, yeah.
The separate part of this that I think you may be reading into that is the purpose of the identification was to do a warrants check. And there was some discussion over whether that was something that should be retained or not. If the police are contacted, they can do that verification. Other 10 encampment facilities have that provision within their requirements, and what we were relayed is typically if you tell a prospective tenant, we're going to check you for warrants, they don't bother checking in. They know there's trouble brewing, and they just go away. Usually it doesn't come down to coming down and have to arrest somebody, they move on. But having the ability to figure out maybe someone has committed a very serious offense and where they are could be very valuable to the police department. We thought that was something that should be retained.
Again, one quick question then. So what is written here, is this the final, or this is the process of where they are? Because I don't, is this it, or is this the final draft?
Well, this draft is a draft. Our ask today is to set a public hearing to have further discussion of this.
Okay, so the final one will probably come out of some public and possibly some other input. There may be some changes to that.
I anticipate there will be further changes. The Human Services Committee has some questions about this draft. Some of the provisions here that really weren't addressed when we went over it.
Sure.
And I'm anticipating there'll be further refinements to this as we go.
Okay, thank you for your information.
One of the provisions excluded dogs from being allowed in these encampments, except for service dogs. There was some thought put into whether that was pertinent, particularly if you were trying to address a family that was maybe out of their house for whatever reason, and if they had some pets, if those could be included. We included that in this draft that you're looking at here. There was a requirement for a public hearing before the hearing examiner. The hearing examiner would have determined and imposed conditions on the tent encampment. We removed that provision from the requirements. There was a separate informal public hearing that was required to let the neighbors and interested parties know that this is something that's being considered, and that was retained so that the neighbors have this back and forth with the city so they can be aware of what's being proposed, perhaps offer something in terms of insightful conditions or something that could be placed into the permit. The provisions, again, as I stated, limited the location to 90 days. The Human Services Committee, when this draft was reviewed, didn't really address the question of how long is the proper amount of time. There is some concern at the staff level that just allowing it forever might not be exactly what is going to be acceptable out of the community. So we landed on a 6-month duration for that. And again, that's going to be, I'm sure, debated further as this goes through the process. One of the elements that was in the draft that was reviewed last year was how to deal with children. In this case, we didn't want to include a haven for minors that are on the run, but minors that are with their parents or a guardian. we want to include them, so that's how the language is written now. There was a condition to return the facilities to their condition that they were in prior to when the permit was issued, within a week of closure. That seemed a little onerous as well to mainly the committee members. Staff agreed giving someone a week to return the property to those conditions seemed a little unreasonable. And by and large, we felt that the churches in particular that might want to host this are probably good neighbors to begin with and want to do the right thing, to not necessarily make that something that happens within a week. That was the legal. There was also a provision to require a parking plan and a transportation plan. That didn't seem to be something that we, based on the size of the facilities we have, would be necessary. There wasn't a lot of discussion over whether it should be near public transportation. That seemed to be a sensible link. We didn't require that, but that might be something, again, that we'll be talking about further. Our request is to set a public hearing for July 6th. We'll be trying to get the word out that this is coming, get the word out in terms of drafts and just allow people opportunity to review this and provide comment. And as I stated, I anticipate that the Human Services Committee will want to make some refinements as this goes through the process. But I think the larger components that we were trying to capture when we did the initial review, the three-tiering, the smaller scale, accommodating family members, those are all, I think, pretty important pieces of this routine.
I have a question. Could you explain a little more the second tier? Is that on private property? Is that on church property?
That is, as proposed in here, on private property. There was some discussion at the committee level on whether that could be something we accommodate on church properties or any properties.
And that's up to 30 people?
That's the largest tier. The point where it is in the draft regulations is that it's 2047-030 Part B. Part B is the second tier. And that was, again, hosted by a religious organization, not on any property within the city.
Hosted, but not on, it could be on private property. It's hosted by a church, but it doesn't have to be church property for the second tier.
It would be, it could be hosted by anyone, but the idea was to have that placed on property of a religious organization.
Okay, property,
Right.
Okay. So does that mean that it's on the property that the church is also located on, or is it?
The church's property. The host could be a nonprofit organization. The host and where the facility is located doesn't have to be the same entity.
Okay,
and that's typical for these encampments.
But it has
there is
to
an
be
organization that's managing them, host 80 engagements, we call it.
Okay, okay. And then I am a little concerned that we're not allowing the youth in any of these encampments, because we know there are a lot of homeless youth that don't have families. Are we looking at making any types of these camps youth only?
That's something that we could consider. There was a lot of discussion over that component of this. There's some safety elements to the having youth at a facility like this that gave us a lot of concern. And how young are you allowed to be there? Are you allowing 10 or 11-year-olds to be there? Is that something you really want to support as a city? Yeah, so that's the reason it's key.
Okay. And then did the police department weigh in on this at all?
No, this still is under review.
Okay. So they will have an opportunity to comment and give input. Okay. Okay.
We can talk more. I can bounce into some ideas that are along with your line, and then we can just discuss this as that.
Okay.
So
yeah,
the police I thought it was important that the police did weigh in on this, because they have their set of rules. But the first thing I want to do is thank the committee for the hard work that they did in putting this together. This is not easy, and the biggest thing that I think you addressed right out, that our city doesn't meet all of the Seattle and Tacoma and Olympia standards on how you do something like that. So, and it's not easy what you're doing. And I think this conversation is very good along with the public hearing, because whenever you start something new like this in a city that's never ever had this before, there will be all sides coming out, and we have to make a decision for everyone how this is going to work. And so I'm glad about the police element. I also am concerned about the kids, the 13, 14, 15-year-old kids. It's sad that our society doesn't have grandparents or churches or something that can, if the parents can't pick up that loop, that you got 10 or 12 or 13 or 14-year-olds that have no place to go and they're just hanging out. This kind of a thing, you know, really, there's something that needs to be for them, whether it's a homeless shelter or something, but making them go is like if folks make them try to stay at home. So I don't know how that fits into the legal ramifications and stuff. So that is an area of this kind of a situation that I kind of feel ought to have something, whether it's a sponsor home or whatever. I mean, I could have a creative idea, and I had one that in these churches that were going to sponsor this, they could have their whole list of things for their congregation to think about, and that would be, there are some 13, 14, 12, 10-year-old kids that can't stay at home anymore and won't go into this, you know, is there a member in the church that would be open to sponsor and bring that child into their home like a step-parent or big brother? You know, that would probably, because then it's a lot more hands-on, it's mentoring, it's, you know, it's not them just living in a tent, it's them actually living in somebody's home because they have no home to live in. So that would be an idea that might help in filling in that. If a church was going to have this, then one of the little side chapters could be, is there anybody here that might be open to sponsor a child that doesn't fit into this? And I think you would have some response. So that would be possibly a way to fill in for those children. The other question I had is on item number A, the number 1, and that's where, let's just say Gary in his backyard wants to put 2 tents up and have 2 families living there, right? Because it's my choice now. Well, Gary probably could do okay, but what I'm afraid of is what if you have a family that's probably not following all of the highest standards of legal, ethical responsibilities, and they have 2 other families that might not want to follow those, and kind of having a camp in their backyard where there is a lot of, you know, I mean, responsible people trying to help people transition out of this tent is one thing, but what kind of oversight would there be to somebody that says, great, and they just, renters, you know, they just move in 2 more renters in their backyard and they go under this, you know, this is not a desire not to help people, this is a desire to help all of us and do the right thing. So the first one, having people camped out in anybody's backyard, that one I probably would say, I think it needs some real rules to it. So that's what just kind of my ramblings on a lot of that stuff. And Commissioner Olson isn't here, but I'm sure he has thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I guess I had less concerns with that because it says that it has to be family members and it's limited to 5. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And is there a time limit on that?
There wasn't one placed on that. The staff's thought was that could be accommodated in a similar manner as to how we currently regulate home occupational businesses, where you come in and you tell us what your intentions are if you're running a accounting business out of your home. Are you going to have employees coming in? Are you going to have clients coming in and going all day, or is it going to be less impactful to your neighborhood than that? And usually we have a checklist of things you answer, and based upon how well that fits in with our codes, we allow or don't allow those home occupations. This is something that we would have to add to our plate of things we're regulating and maintaining. But it's, there was also a strong desire of the committee to try to incorporate some way of, as you're describing, helping family members who may be and this was my intention to address that.
Okay. I guess I don't have as many concerns with that one. My number 1 concern with all of this is to provide housing for those who need it, but also to protect the investment of the neighborhoods. You know, many people, this is their biggest investment, and there isn't a lot of money in our city to and I would hate for the neighborhoods to become degraded because of these type of uses. So I think we do have to really be mindful of that, and I appreciate the efforts that are made in here, in this document. So, and obviously we do have some more work to do, more discussion. I understand that SPAC committee has some changes maybe they would like, as you have said. So
there was another emerging issue of sorts when this draft was crafted. Sort of on a follow-up, there was some discussion over the types of structures that someone could be allowed to be in, whether it's a tent or some other newer sort of leading edge.
A camper or a trailer in the backyard.
Well, yeah, and in other cities now, folks are making temporary structures out of pallets. I mean, lots of different things are happening up there, and we could probably do well by focusing on what maybe we're permitting the types, the numbers, and I anticipate that'll be in the refinements of this as it comes forward.
On the issue of the pets, I know that pets are part of the family, and where the family goes, the pet must go. A lot of times, just for family health. Do we have any regulations on the pets? Like, I'm just thinking that in a confined area or in close quarters like that, if you have a number of dogs, it would be important to make sure that each of those dogs are immunized.
Yeah, that's right.
So I don't know if that is too cumbersome, but it seems that it is an important point to me to make sure that we're not having diseased animals spreading disease.
Okay.
To follow up on that point, my concern was the possibility of somebody that had a dog that had had some previous encounters, like that dangerous encounters with people. They were now in a more confined space, they're bringing a family pet who just got out of jail because it bit something, I mean, those kinds of things, and again, that's just a thought. And back to the number one, here as far as value of someone's property is if you have a decent home and you're living somewhere in the city and all of a sudden your neighbor next door chooses to have 2 tents with their families living in the backyard next door to your house, and you want to sell your house, it will affect the sales price of your house. Just like a vacant, boarded up house that's being broken into with the abandoned houses, just like in talking to different people, especially about those, this opens up kind of a whole nother can of worms. In a good situation where families trying to help somebody and staying in their backyard, and there's and a good neighborhood and all these things, but sometimes you allow for something and then it stretches that envelope to where you could have some situations that aren't exactly as beneficial to everyone as it would seem. So these are all just thoughts and concerns I've kind of had, and I've only had this, a few days just kind of rambling over a little bit, but I think it's something that we have to do. I think in all of our discussions, I think we will come up with something, and then it's possibly a learning process, so a year from now or 2 years from now, when certain situations get set up, we can say, oh, we didn't understand that element of it. But I guess in this town, because of possibly the location to the prison and the economic condition, having 2 tents in anybody's backyard, to house family members, I'm just wondering if that's going to work very well, So, and again, it's whatever the people want. You're going to have a public hearing. We have the committee. Maybe they'll go back and draft some. If anything, I would think it'd have to be some oversight on that activity, because if bad people decided, it would just be real destructive to the neighbors. I think if they just had a, party in the backyard over there. So, okay. Any other comments or questions?
No.
All right, thank you very much for your work on this, and again, the committee's work, and I think that we can follow your proposal to set a public hearing for July 6, 2015, to accept written and oral testimony on the proposed regulations.